Hi, it's week 3, and I hope you're caught up on week 1 and 2. There's an assignment and a quiz for each week, always due on Fridays. So I really want to ask you a question now that you've been learning a little bit about forestry. And the question I want to ask you is, what do you think you need to know to manage a forest? So you've been given 100 acres and they've asked you to manage this forest. What's the first thing you're going to have to do, and what are you going to need to know? So that's what I want to talk about today, is that we have to learn how to study the forest. We're going to classify them and understand the regions, and then we're going to learn the trees. So you're going to be learning tree identification, and then how they grow, and how the whole ecosystem works together. So let's get started on this, and I'll ask you questions at the end of each section. So there's 5 ways to describe a forest. The first one is by species composition. So a pure forest is what's considered all or nearly all the trees are the same species, and a mixed forest is trees of 2 or more species. So pure or mixed. The example in this photo is a mixed forest of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir. The next way is by stand density, and that is whether it's dense or well stocked, which is super crowded, thin or medium stocked, or poorly stocked. And you can measure that by measuring the percent shade or the basal area. And this is an example of a thinly stocked ponderosa pine forest. The third is the age composition. And this is one of the things we can do by doing an increment bore. And that is it even aged or all aged? This is an example of an even aged lodgepole pine forest, which is pretty common in Colorado. So all the trees are of the same age. The forest type and species, and here's an example of the state of Colorado. And the trees are color coded, and they're pinyon and juniper mix, they're aspen, they're pondo, they're Engelmann subalpine, they're Doug, they're lodgepole, mixed, or riparian. So these are all the different forest regions we're going to be studying, and we'll be learning about the specific silvicultural characteristics of each of those. The fifth one really isn't one of the categories, and I see this is a little blurry, but we also study our plants in Colorado by their life zones. So the life zones that we'll talk about is alpine, subalpine, montane zone, foothills zone, which is the zone we live here at Horsetooth and Laurie State Park, and the plains zone, which is from Fort Collins and east. So you'll get a nice handout of this, so you won't have any problems understanding this. Now, if we're going to decide whether we're going to preserve land or manage land, Yellowstone versus Roosevelt Forest, we're going to have to know how much forest is out there. So there's some definitions and terminology you're going to need to learn. So to start with, 1/3 of the United States is covered with forests. Of 2.3 billion acres, 737 million acres are forested. This is 2/3 of the forest cover that existed in the 1600s. So think about that video we saw on the first day and see how that fits in with what the video was saying. Forest growth has continually exceeded harvest since the 1940s. And growth today exceeds the harvest by 33%. Now, of course, we can make statistics mean or say, can make them mean whatever they want, and we can make them say whatever they want. So these are facts put out by the U.S. Forest Foundation, but another organization might be putting out different facts, as you saw in the movie. Now, the definitions you'll need to be aware of is forest land, an area at least 1 acre and contain 10% tree cover. Timberland is land that is capable of growing 20 cubic feet per acre of industrial wood. Not all timberland is used for harvesting. Sometimes it's because they can't get to it. Federal lands of the nation's 490 million acres of timberland, 97 million acres are owned by the federal government. Their use is determined by laws and administrative decisions. Some is managed for non-commercial uses, and some actually is set aside for wilderness protection, so keep that in mind. Timberland management, so think about industry, is also including non-industrial private landowners, federal, state, and local governments, and all must manage for multiple uses. So timberland is managed for the production of wood. Non-industrial private owners manages for a variety of objectives like a tree farm. Of all, here's the key, of all the timber harvested in the United States, 50% comes from non-industrial private landowners. Now, how are we going to educate private landowners? It's a very good question that will be answered. Of the nation's timberland, 27% is owned by federal, state, and local. 59% is small tracts by private owners, and only 14% is owned by the forest products industry. Can you name 3 industries that are part of the forest products industry? Think about your lumber at Home Depot or something like that. So that's an introduction. Now I'm going to ask you some questions about that slideshow to make sure you understand what we're talking about. And then part 2 is going to be moving on to forest regions.